much, and good evening. We hopefully soon will have the map of Syria and Iraq coming up. Very good, which will be of great assistance to me in the course of this talk. What I want to try and do in the course of the next half an hour or so is to trace the process, I suppose is the best way of putting it, whereby a single sectarian war has broken out in the territories still officially known as Iraq and Syria, and the process whereby this war may well also be breaking into banks and westwards direction into Lebanon. And what I want to do is to look first of all at the beginnings of the Syrian war and the process by which the country became split into enclaves or areas of control. And I'm going to consider each of these in a little bit of detail. The regime-controlled area, of course, of Assad regime, the Kurdish areas, the Islamic State, and of course the remaining rebel areas, which are increasingly dominated, as I'll go on to try to illustrate, by Jabhat al-Nusra, that is to say, by the official franchise of the Al-Qaeda core leadership in Syria. And I'll then go on to note, of course, the Islamic State offensive into Iraq last summer, and how this broke the borders of the war in such a radical way, and as I said, also perhaps to look a little bit at Lebanon. The thing you can see here is slightly out of date. It's from June 2014. It nevertheless illustrates broadly the areas of control which I just mentioned. The regime-controlled area here, the Iraqi government-controlled area here, the Kurdish enclaves along the north, and of course the brown area represented by Islamic State, which would now, of course, have a great deal more area going further east. But just to give you, the map gives you a general impression, which I'll go on to discuss in a little bit more details. First of all, then, to recap the facts regarding the Syrian war, how it broke out, how it progressed. And interesting to cast our minds back to those distant days of early 2011, and to remember that the Assad regime, or to remember just how badly the Assad regime was caught unawares, was surprised and shocked by the outbreak of civilian protest in March, or officially on March 15th, 2011. The Assad regime having sort of awarded itself a get-out clause, we would say in English, from the Arab Spring, as it was then known. And Bashar gave an interesting interview on January 30th, 2011, to the Wall Street Journal newspaper, in which he went into great detail as to why there had not yet been an uprising in Syria, as opposed to what had already then taken place in Tunisia and in Egypt, and as to why, in Bashar's estimation, there would not be an uprising in Syria. And Bashar went on to talk in great detail as to what he considered was the way in which his regime represented the inner will of the Syrian people in opposing humiliation on the part of the West and Israel, and standing up for the Palestinian cause, and so on and so forth. In any case, hubris being the natural accompaniment to, or nemesis rather, being the natural follower to hubris, as we learnt at school. On March 15th, 2011, in spite of Bashar's interview to the Wall Street Journal, protests broke out, of course, in the southern province of Daraa. The regime tried hard to crush the protests, killing a number of school children. The protests were not crushed and began to spread, and rapidly the country found itself in the midst of what was then, in spring of 2011, an unarmed civilian uprising or protest against the Assad dictatorship. Interestingly, the regime initially made some rather ham-fisted or partial attempts at reform in responding to the protests. First of all, the unfortunate Mr. Faisal Khaltoum, the then governor of Daraa province, lost his job as a result of the activities the forces took against the protests. Nationality was granted to a number, tens of thousands of Syrian Kurds who, for reasons we can go into later if people are interested, there's a whole population of Kurds in northern Syria who are Syrian-born but have no citizenship. So Bashar tried to offer them citizenship as an initial reform. The state scrapped a ruling which banned teachers from wearing the niqab, from wearing full Islamic dress, and emergency laws in place since the mid-60s were officially rescinded. You will not be surprised to know, and of course you in any case already know, that these very minor, superficial attempts at reform did not succeed in taking the wind out of the sails of the uprising. As a result, the protests continued, and basically from mid-April of 2011, the regime went into a process of frontal confrontation against the uprising against it, which effectively remains in place until today. It's been in place ever since and up until today. The results are that around 220,000 people have now lost their lives as a result of 4 years of uprising and civil war in Syria. There are at least 2.5 million, and maybe quite a number more, refugees who've left the country. There's an additional 6.5 million Syrians displaced inside the country itself, as the internal refugees. And of course, there are unknown numbers in regime custody, unknown numbers who have passed into that unseen kingdom in Syria of the massive prison system maintained by the Assad dictatorship. And since early 2013, the military situation has effectively been at stalemate in Syria. That is to say, as we see on the map, rebel forces have succeeded in carving out large swathes of territory in the rural north and east, which are now firmly under their control. But the regime continues to hold all the major cities in the country, with the exceptions of the provincial capital of Raqqa province, which is in the hands of Islamic State. And also, since 2 weeks, as of 2 weeks ago, the city of Idlib in the north west of the country, which is controlled now by Jabhat al-Nusra, and also about half of Aleppo, which is disputed between the regime and the rebels. As I said, the regime still has Damascus. Let me perhaps try and play a little bit of this. It still has the capital of city of Damascus here. And as you can see from the coloration, it controls the kind of spine of the country, going up here through Homs and Hama, main populated city, urban areas of the country. There is also, and I mentioned it and I'll talk more in a moment, the Kurdish enclave, of course, and also the Islamic State. Let's look for a moment, however, at how Syria arrived at the situation you see in the map. I mentioned at the beginning, the uprising began as an unarmed phenomenon. As the regime tried to crush it, so the natural response of the opposition was to begin to take up arms. And we can trace the foundation of the Free Syrian Army, you're all familiar with that ringing term, from July 29th, 2011. What took place in the course of the remainder of 2011 and early 2012 was that the Free Syrian Army, the Syrian rebels, began to establish control over a number of towns and villages. In Idlib province we mentioned, they took control of Zabadani, close to Damascus. Eventually also the town of Homs was controlled for a while by the rebels. Even down towards Damascus itself, a number of northern suburbs falling into the hands of the rebels. And in February 2012, which was the time I can tell you when I made my first visit to report into Syria and witnessed some of this close up, the regime began a concerted campaign to wipe out these rebel-held areas, these areas that had fallen into the hands of the rebellion. They took Duma, they retook Homs, killing a large number of civilians in the process. They were trying to reunite the country in time for a ceasefire, which probably nobody here remembers because it was an abortive ceasefire, but a ceasefire prepared by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, which was meant to come into place in April 2012. So the regime was trying hard to reunite the country in time for what they hoped would be the ceasefire. But a fascinating process became apparent in the course of that 2012 counter-offensive by the regime, and it was the following. They swept through the towns and villages of northern Syria, which had been controlled by the rebels and formed their heartland. They were able to take any given point in the geographical map of Syria that they wished to. They could concentrate forces and take town or village, doesn't matter, Sabnin or Binish or any of these little towns controlled by the rebels. But when the regime forces moved on, the uprising reignited in the area which they had just conquered. That is to say, it became apparent in the spring of 2012 that the Assad regime, and this is an absolutely crucial point to understand and relevant still today, the Assad regime did not have sufficient manpower to place all areas in revolt under permanent occupation. When the armed forces move on, the uprising re-emerges. This exposed the crucial weakness of the Assad regime, which remains to this day, namely a shortage of reliable manpower. Assad simply has a shortage of people willing to take a bullet on his behalf. This has prevented him, this simple demographic crucial fact, has prevented him from being able to reunite and reconquer the country. What then was the solution which Assad sought to respond to this unfortunate, from his point of view, shortage of manpower to reunite the entire country? The solution that the regime found, and probably saved its own life or kept itself in existence as a result of this decision, was in the summer of 2012, the regime withdrew unilaterally from a large swathe of territory in the north of Syria, effectively ushering into being, with its consent, so to speak, a rebel-controlled area. And by doing so, effectively partitioning or dividing the country into the enclaves, which we talked about earlier, which we still see: regime, rebels, Kurds, and of course now Islamic State as well. The point of this was not to a gesture of solidarity to do a favour to the rebels. The point was Assad understood a smaller area under his control could be effectively defended by the smaller number of men that he had available to it. And of course Assad also left an area in the majority Kurdish northeast of the country which was not in revolt against him, and this area was rapidly taken over by the PKK, the local franchise of the Kurdish military organisation PKK. So in mid-2012, effectively the situation emerged which we see here on the map and which exists still to this day in Syria. Effectively 3 enclaves, or now it's 4 enclaves since Islamic State. None of the sides strong enough to destroy the other, none of the sides weak enough to be destroyed by the other, and therefore all of them continuing in existence and continuing to be viable, at least on the most basic of levels. What I'd like to do now then is to look at each of these enclaves a little bit in terms of their inner composition and in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. First of all, let's look at the Assad regime. And we know where we're looking at, we've already done this little trick a few times. So this area here, controlled by the Assad regime. The Assad regime has maintained the minimum key elements required for its survival throughout the course of the uprising. The political circle around the president has seen no major defections since March 2011. It's absolutely crucial. It means, even though you remember seeing reports on the news of this stream of Syrian officers and soldiers who were going over to the rebellion in its first months, the fact of the matter is no one from Assad's inner circle, no one from his immediate family, no central army chiefs went over to the rebellion, even in the darkest days from the regime point of view of late 2012. And now that the regime appears much less near collapse, of course such defections are much less likely. That is to say, the inner core, the basic core structure of Assad regime has stayed intact throughout the course of the war. The economy too has drastically contracted, but it has survived. There has not been a general economic collapse into malnutrition and starvation taking place in regime-controlled Syria. This is largely, by the way, in my estimation at least, due to the very generous donations afforded this regime by the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is really what has kept this entity afloat. With regard to the military forces available to Assad, well, I mentioned his problem with manpower. On paper, Assad has a huge army. The Syrian Arab Army, on paper, controls 220,000 troops with an additional 280,000 reserves. But the problem is that the regime can't use most of those forces, because most of those forces are Sunni Arab conscripts who would not be willing to take a bullet on Assad's behalf. But the regime has benefited from having a number of specialized units, largely composed of Alawi soldiers, that's to say soldiers from the same ethnic or sectarian origin as the President Assad himself, and these forces have remained loyal to him, and we can list among them, for those of us who are follow this stuff closely. The Republican Guards, you're aware of probably, the Special Forces also, and of course the famous 4th Armoured Division, this division of heavy armour which does not involve itself in fighting on the borders against Syria's enemies, but rather exists to protect the regime against its own people. These have remained loyal throughout. In addition to these divisions, and this is important to remember, the regime maintained from the outset a force of irregulars, which came to be known as the Shabicha, around 60 to 70,000 men, almost exclusively of Alawi origin. Now, in the course of 2013, the Iranians, together with Hezbollah, entered the country and turned this gathering of irregulars into something like a new army, a new lightly armed sectarian army to act on the basis, to act for Assad and to plug the gap in manpower, which I've been mentioning consistently, which was his main problem. And it is these forces, the Popular Army or National Defense Force, these 60 to 70,000 men who've helped to plug the gap and to act on behalf of the regime. But the most important missions, and difficult and sensitive and dangerous missions, increasingly are undertaken on behalf of Assad by Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon. We think there's around 10,000 of them in the country at any given time, and increasingly also by Iranian personnel themselves. So Assad has survived, but Assad increasingly in the process of survival has gone from being an independent ruler of Syria to being an independent ruler of part of Syria, to being a man who less and less is independent at all, but is more and more dependent on his foreign support from the Iranians and from the Hezbollah organization. Having said that, then, or to conclude, with regard to Assad, the regime has been stretched, but it is in no danger of imminent collapse. It is also not strong enough to begin the reconquest of the country. And we see yet again that when it tries to reconquer areas, once it moves on, the uprising breaks out again. Thus far then with regard to the Assad regime. What about with regard to the rebels? And let us just have fun with this again. The rebels, which we're talking about, marked in this actually is a very unsuccessful map. Here, for anybody who look what a silly map this is. They're using basically the same colour to talk about the Syrian rebels and also the Kurds. How are we supposed to be able to tell the difference between that? Your guess is as good as mine. But with the tools available to us, let me say it for you. This is the area of Syrian rebels, in the southwest edge of the country, close to the Golan Heights, of course, the main place further up. And then this area here in the northwest is their heartland. It is Idlib and Aleppo provinces, controlled by the Syrian rebellion since mid-2012 and up to and including today. What then with regard to the rebel-controlled areas, the nature of them, the strengths and weaknesses? If Assad's central weakness is the absence of sufficient manpower, then the central weakness of the rebels has been throughout their failure to unite, their failure to succeed in creating a single structure of command and control to lead the rebel-controlled areas and to form an alternative possible government to that of Assad. Divided they stand, but they're still standing. So they have control, as we said, of Idlib and Aleppo provinces, section of Dara province and Quneitra in the south-west. The most important rebel gathering today is Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra is the official franchise, as I mentioned, of Al-Qaeda core leadership in Syria. This is not a fact which gives me any particular joy to relate, as somebody who was one of the first foreign journalists to spend time with the Syrian rebels, with whose cause most people of conscience have a natural sympathy for, but one needs to be aware of the facts. And the fact is that Jabhat al-Nusra is by far the best organized and most keen to fight of any of the Syrian rebels. It has around 15,000 men, established in early 2012. And in the course of the last few months, Nusra has been busy swallowing up, so to speak, many other of the rebel formations in the northwest of the country. And specifically and interestingly, it has been acting against those organizations that were supported by the West. Those organizations that received active military and financial help from the United States and from the West. We can think of two specific organizations of this kind, which maybe some people here have heard of, or I hope you have. One is Syrian Revolutionaries Front, controlled by a man called Jamal Ma'ruf, with whom maybe you're familiar. And another is a much smaller militia called Hazm, which was the direct recipient of PGM-71 Tau anti-tank missiles from the Americans in mid-2014. And these organizations have effectively ceased to exist, because Nusra has swallowed them up. Nusra, therefore, is in the process of achieving domination within what we can still call the rebel-controlled areas. By the way, just to be clear on this, in the southwest of the country, that's to say this rebel-controlled area, the situation is a little bit different, because there, the Western-supported rebels of what was called the Southern Front are still very much in the game. But even down there, Nusra is the single strongest force, in my estimation, at war on behalf of the rebels. Thus far, then, with regard to the rebel-controlled areas. With regard to the Islamic State, of which we are all very familiar, let's take a quick look at a few items of information with regard to this organization. Well, of course, Islamic State has its origins in the Islamic State organization, ISIS, or Daesh, whichever we want to call it, has its origins in Iraq, not in Syria. It was the Islamic State in Iraq, first of all, founded, of course, with that name in 2004, with the intention of fighting the American occupation of Iraq. And fight it did, of course, under the famous leader, Abu Musa al-Zarqawi, who was killed by the Americans in 2006, I believe he lost his life. And this organization was effectively defeated by the Americans in the course of the surge of 2006-2007. It existed in nucleus form subsequently, however, and with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, so this organization spied a possibility of a return to relevance, established a large presence in the rebel-controlled governments of Raqqa, Idlib, Deir ez-Zor and Aleppo. In February 2014, was officially expelled from the Al-Qaeda structures. Al-Qaeda concluded that Nusra was its appropriate representative in Syria, and not ISIS. And then, entering into a civil war within a civil war, this Islamic State effectively carved out by force, by violence, against other rebels, an area of control of its own in the months of mid-2014, which it then, with astonishing audacity, on June 29th, 2014, declared that this area consisted of the long-awaited Islamic revival of the long-awaited Islamic Caliphate. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, its leader, a not particularly well-known jihadi from central Iraq, was henceforth to be known as Ibrahim, Caliph Ibrahim, the natural and rightful ruler, in his opinion, and that of his friends, of the world's Muslim population. That is to say, the astonishing audacity, the chutzpah, we would say, in any other context, but not in this one, of ISIS, was to effectively say this little dusty area of ground, in the Syrian-Iraqi border area that it had conquered, was effectively, from mid-2014, claiming religious authority over all Muslims worldwide, with the intention of bringing first the Levant and Mesopotamia, and eventually the entire region under its control. Audacious it may have seemed, perhaps even absurdly so, but as we will go on to note in a moment, the ISIS offensive into Iraq of June and then August last year came within a whisker of taking the capital of Iraq, of Baghdad, and of destroying Iraqi Kurdistan. So they may have been audacious, but they also backed it up with considerable, surprisingly major ability on the military field. Lastly, and I should consider a little bit of detail too, the Kurdish enclaves of northern Syria. Jazeera, which is here, Kobani, and then Afrin in the northwest. Three non-contiguous enclaves maintained by the PYD, Democratic Union Party of Syrian Kurds, which actually is the franchise of the PKK organization in Syria, even though for various pragmatic reasons it sometimes likes to pretend that it's not. And I can tell you that somebody who I've reported from within those enclaves, not Afrin, but the other two, on a considerable number of occasions, you can take it from me, if you are willing to, that this Kurdish Rojava, these Kurdish enclaves, it's a PKK production from start to finish, and I'll be happy to talk in more detail about that later on if people would like to in questions. Thus far, then, 4 enclaves, which we have now looked at in some little bit of detail. Assad regime, holding on in spite of its shortage of manpower. The rebel areas increasingly controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra, let's say Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State area controlled by this very extreme stream, so to speak, of Sunni jihadism, and the Kurdish areas, which are controlled by the PKK. Those four enclaves are what Syria currently consists of, and in my estimation, those four enclaves are what Syria is going to continue to consist of for some considerable time to come. What I'd like to then go on to do in this final section is to look at the most recent developments, so to speak, in the course of the last year. What has changed? What have we witnessed to alter that picture or to complicate it? And of course, the most important and complicating factor to have taken place since this time last year, so to speak, since April 2014, is the eruption of all this whole story across the border into Iraq. That is to say, it's no longer a Syrian war, it's now a single war in both Syria and Iraq. And we remember the timing and the shock in June of last year of the ISIS offensive into Iraq, and of course of the capture of the city of Mosul, one of the major cities with a population of over 1 million of Iraq. And indeed, not stopping at Mosul, the genuine sense of the possibility, as July turned into August, of ISIS menacing the Iraqi capital of Baghdad and menacing also the northern capital, the Iraqi Kurdish capital of Erbil. Just a few kilometers, about 45 kilometers outside of each city, these ISIS forces reached. And we recall the humanitarian catastrophe which took place in northern Iraq as a result of the capture by ISIS of the towns of Zumar and Sinjar, populated by the members of a small Iraqi religious or sectarian minority, which many of us have probably never heard of, called the Yazidis. When I studied Middle East studies back in England in the 90s, I recall that we were all very interested in the Yazidis among the very large list of ethnic minority or sectarian minority populations in Iraq, because many of the textbooks also referred to them as devil worshippers. And this, of course, turned out to be a lot less funny in the summer of 2014, because this was certainly the view of them which ISIS took. And from ISIS' point of view, what that meant was that the very basic claims to at least the preservation of life, which members of monotheistic religions might be able to ask, at least, the Islamic State from the Yazidi point of view, were not available. These were people whose very lives were forfeit. And we witnessed, of course, you remember the fleeing of this population in the face of the advance of the jihadis and this gathering of population in the Sinjar mountain area, if you remember, and they're cut off there by ISIS. We're talking about the central months of summer. We're in August 2014 now. No food, very little water, beginnings of people starving or people dying from dehydration. And as a result of that urgent imperative, and I would think also as a result of the desire that ISIS should not have rolled into the oil-rich sections of central Iraq, we note from 7th August, of course, the commencement of American bombing against the Islamic State with the intention of holding it up, degrading it, and so President Obama told us, eventually destroying this entity. Let me say that I'm not a fan of all aspects of current US policy, but I think all of us should be aware that the United States air action of early August 2014 very probably did prevent what would have been a genocide in northern Iraq. That is to say that had the Americans not intervened to stop the Islamic State advance, tens of thousands of people would have been slaughtered. I was actually in Erbil in mid-August 2014. Around 30% of the population had fled, and a new population of refugees were there. And ISIS was just 45 kilometers outside of the town, facing a dry, dusty plain between their positions and Erbil city. And the reason they'd stopped moving forward was not because of the Kurdish military effectiveness, it was because they understood that if they rolled forward from that point, the United States Air Force would simply blow them out of existence. They had no effective response to that. Had it not been for the United States air power, they would almost without doubt have taken Erbil, and tens of thousands would have lost their lives. So this is something to bear in mind. So we saw the advance of Islamic State and the establishment of Islamic State on both sides of the Iraq and Syrian borders. From their point of view at least, the effective abolition of that border, that colonial border. As of now, however, as a result of the coalition actions which I just mentioned, ISIS is no longer advancing eastwards. It was menacing the town of Ramadi in recent days. It was trying to get to the Baiji oil refinery, but it's been turned back from the oil refinery. It has lost a considerable section of ground further north as the Peshmerga have recovered their wits, so to speak, and begun to push ISIS back on the Erbil-Mosul plain. So it's no longer moving forward in an easterly direction, but at the same time, it has consolidated its rule within its areas of control, and it shows no sign whatsoever of being dislodged anywhere in the immediate future time. Elsewhere, in August of last year, the war began also to spill over into Lebanon as Nusra and ISIS launched a joint attack on the town of Arsal, kidnapping, I think it was 25 Lebanese army soldiers, most of whom are still held. Some of them have been executed subsequently. And this clash represented a renewed front in the war, so to speak, in which Nusra and ISIS, having witnessed Hezbollah's very major intervention into Syria in the course of the last 4 years, are very, very keen to return the compliment, so to speak, and to try to begin to be active in Hezbollah's backyard. But neither Hezbollah nor the Lebanese armed forces are clowns. They're both aware of that, and they're doing their level best to try to prevent that. But the Lebanese front is something we should also be thinking about. So where does it all go from here then, by way of conclusion? Let's be clear what we've just been describing in the course of the last hour, nearly half an hour. These are details which describe a process in which central state authority has effectively collapsed in two major countries of the Arab world, and a number of political military frameworks organized more or less along ethnic and sectarian lines are making war among the ruins. This is a process of historical importance, and these frameworks are joined in a series of alliances, taking in elements in each of the countries, also in Syria, also in Iraq, and also in Lebanon. The most coherent alliance engaged in all this is the mainly Shia alliance aligned with the Islamic Republic of Iran and consisting of the governments of Syria, that's to say Assad regime in Syria, the government of Iraq, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. There is a Kurdish alliance too. We've talked about this geographically, so we should note. This is a massive land area, okay, all the way to the border with Iran, across northern Iraq, into Syria, and halfway across this very long border between Syria and Turkey. And that entire area today is under Kurdish control. It's not under the control of a single Kurdish organization, but it's one great big contiguous area of Kurdish control. Deeply important development. And lastly, of course, on the Sunni Arab side, the situation far more confused and murky, but the emergent strongest forces, to reiterate what we already said, the Islamic State, one of them, and controlling that area in eastern Syria, and Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda presence, which has nothing in Iraq, of course, but is strong in northwest of Syria, and is probably receiving support from Qatar and possibly also from Turkey. Also, we can talk about that in questions if people would like to. To conclude then, what are we looking at in terms of possible prospects for all this, and perhaps for resolution of all this? I must say, frankly, that I'm not optimistic that this situation is going to be concluded anytime soon. We're not dealing with a little blip in the otherwise calm history of the Middle East in the modern times at all with this. What we're dealing with is a historic convulsion in which states which were assembled by Western fiat and which were held together largely by force, by very, very strong and brutal dictatorial regimes for the best part of half a century, are now in the process of collapse. In some cases, the regime has been removed from outside, like Gaddafi in Libya or Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In other cases, like Syria, the regime is still there, but it's being pushed back. And as these regimes are destroyed or recede, the natural contradictions in the societies that were always there and that were never resolved are coming, once again, to the fore. So most importantly, the sectarian and ethnic differences that were never resolved by these states, but were simply suppressed, are now coming to form the basis of political organisation. Where will all this lead? When will it end? None of us can say. I suspect, however, that when it does eventually end, as end it must, the map of the Middle East, and by that I mean the political map of the borders of the Middle East, may well be radically different to the familiar set of borders that we got used to in the post-Ottoman period and up to 2011, which we thought would be there forever, but which may well, like so many other political arrangements of the past, having looked immensely strong and solid 1 minute, finally turn out to have been lighter than air, so to speak, to be absolutely disappearable, and very possibly will be disappearing in the period ahead. On that note, I will be quiet, and I'll be very happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I would like to start our discussion with posing three questions myself, and then quickly open up to all of you and give you the possibility to ask questions and just have the opportunity to take part on and give the perspective from your knowledge that is really very fascinating and incredible. First of all, in the end of your presentation, you were talking about a little bit about the international influences that were there. You were talking about the Iranian-led axis on the one hand, and about Sunni countries like Qatar and Turkey on the other hand. There is obviously still a third, well, interested or disinterested part missing there, and that's obviously the West. What has the West been doing all through this last 4 years? Has the West, leading Western power being the United States, has the West had any perception of the strategic landscape and of what is actually taking place? And could it have had any influence of the evolving drama in Syria at one point or the other?
It's been very clear since the outset of the events in Syria that the United States administration was determined not to get involved. And pretty much anything could happen, and the American determination would remain in place. We now know, in the course of the first year of the uprising, that there were considerable elements within American governance who were in favour of backing the rebellion in various ways, which we can talk about, and that Secretary of State, or then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and also then CIA Chief General David Petraeus, were among that section of opinion which believed that at that early stage it might have been possible to have created a united rebel force, non-Islamist rebel force, which could then have been helped to march southwards to Damascus and to end the war with the defeat of Bashar al-Assad. For what it's worth, which I guess is not much, but just for the record, I happen to be one of the people who had that view too, and I don't think we were wrong. I think at that stage it would have been possible to have created something quite different in Syria. And I was in Syria in February 2012, in one of the cradles of the revolt in Idlib province. And I can tell you that at that stage, from what I myself witnessed, the jihadis were there, but they were not yet dominant. And most of the men carrying arms against Assad at that time were recent defectors from the army, officers and men. Well, it didn't happen, of course, and as we now know from within the United States discussion, internal discussion, it was President Obama himself who remained absolutely and staunchly opposed to any such actions, and effectively, as the chief executive, prevented them from having any chance of coming to fruition. So I believe that a chance was missed at that stage. The chance is long gone now, of course, far too late, but it was missed at that stage. The other key thing to remember, Florian, is the other key moment, of course, was the issue of chemical weaponry, use of chemical weapons in the course of 2013. If you remember, the red line clearly set by President Obama, and then the clear evidence emerging of use of chemical weapons. At this stage, I'd just like to say, a slight caveat, or a slight aside in this regard, we're often very critical of media coverage and very critical of the professional media, and sometimes justifiably so. But the journalists who revealed, from Le Monde and from the London Times, who revealed the evidence of Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons in both Damascus and the Aleppo area, were doing great work on behalf of humanity by doing so. This is not hyperbole to say, and we should, I think, respect and note that and honour it. Unfortunately, as a result of the machinations of policy, as it turned out, the red line was not a red line. The regime used chemical weapons. It did not pay any price for it, and it is continuing, in spite of the fact that, officially speaking, Syria is now empty of chemical weapons, because of Bashar's supposed willingness to cooperate in their removal. We already have evidence of the use of chlorine 3 weeks ago to kill oppositionists in the Damascus area, so the regime is still using chemical weapons. So the absolute determination of the West, which means the United States of America, not to get involved in this from the outset and up until today, has been one of the few consistent lines maintained throughout this conflict. And just to conclude on this question, it remains so today. You may be familiar with the project, stated United States project, to arm and train 15,000 rebel fighters in the course of the next 3 years to fight not Assad, but rather to fight the Islamic State. Everything which we are hearing as close Syria watchers is that the first 5,000 of those men who were meant to be recruited this year have not even been recruited. They haven't even got 5,000 rebels willing to serve under that banner up until the present time. And even if they were recruited, the basic questions about how they're going to fight, who they're going to fight, what's going to stop Assad's air force from blowing them to nothingness as soon as they cross the border, none of these questions have been adequately answered. So the Western desire to stay out has been consistent from the start, and in spite of some appearances and statements, it remains absolutely in place today.
So, with the West absolutely doing everything it can to stay out of the war, other actors were certainly taking action there. As there is no ground force available for the West to cooperate with, apart from, of course, the Kurds in northern Syria and northern Iraq, during the last couple of months, it turned out that the only seemingly efficient fighting force against ISIS are Shiite militias in Iraq. And it seems at least as if in the US administration and as well in many media reports here in Austria and in Europe, there is this thought of a rapprochement with Iran that could lead to Iran as a factor for stability in the region, first and foremost in the fight against ISIS. Is there any perspective, any chance that this theory or this strategy is going to work out in Iraq or in Syria?
Well, it depends what you mean by working out. I mean, in a certain sense, yes, if you can back the Shia militias, they can have some military achievements. And we saw first of all in Amerli, and now we've seen in Tikrit as well recently, that the militias are capable of defeating ISIS sometimes with the correct organisation and backing. Is this a good outcome? Well, I don't understand really how people can maintain an ethical difference between ISIS and the Shia militias. On the contrary, one can observe their behaviour. These are more or less identical to one another. That is to say that the actions of the Shia militias against the local Sunni population when they take Tikrit or elsewhere are no more enlightened and humane and liberal than are the actions of ISIS when it takes over areas. Equally brutal, equally sectarian, equally oppressive. So on an ethical level, there is absolutely nothing to choose between the two. On a political level, I also struggle to understand how somebody can convince themselves that Iranian gains in any country of the Arab world is somehow in the service of the West. It's in the service of Iran. If you happen to be a supporter of the Iranian regime, of course it's a wonderful thing that's happening. But if you happen to not be a supporter of the Iranian regime, then what you observe as Hezbollah grows stronger in Lebanon, as the regime holds on in south and western Syria, and as the government and Shia militias gain ground in central Iraq, is that the Iranian project of regional domination, and specifically the Iranian project of creating a contiguous line of pro-Iranian states between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea, comes closer and closer to fruition. Is that a good thing? Well, again, if you happen to believe that a Middle East dominated by the Islamic Republic of Iran, a body which engages in active violence against Westerners which was supporting an assassination plan against the Saudi ambassador to the United States on American soil as recently as 2011, which is committed to the destruction of Israel, which is a regime which supports Holocaust denial. That the advance of this regime across the region is the result of that. This is a very, very negative outcome indeed. Now, let me say the following. The Iranians are overstretched at the moment. They are actively engaged in conflict arenas, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, and arguably also in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, and they're under tough sanctions, and they're growingly short of resources. And we have noticed in recent months that looking at Hezbollah in Lebanon, you can see ways in which Hezbollah is penny pinching and is cutting back, because the money just isn't there anymore in the way that it has been in the past. Now, if an agreement takes place on June 30th on the Iranian nuclear program, it is likely that a massive amount of funding is going to be freed. One of the figures I've heard is $50 billion of oil money is going to become available to the Iranians in the months ahead. That, of course, will end the overstretch, that will end the penny pinching, that will be a massive contribution to the Iranian effort across the region, which you asked about. My own view is that Iran is a deeply dangerous regime, and any notion we have that by feeding it, you're going to make it more moderate, is absolutely the opposite of the actual situation.
I might add, because we're talking about Iran, that we finished work on our book in March of this year. So obviously the Lausanne agreement, or whatever you want to call it, has happened afterwards. We still think that most of our analysis concluded in this book is relevant, insofar as we do not happen to believe that what happened in Lausanne actually did change that much, or is a breakthrough of historic dimensions, as it was often talked about in the media. But we might talk about that later on in our discussion. So I would like now to open up the discussion to you in the audience, and we'll be happy to get your questions.
Hello, good evening. Welcome to Vienna, Jonathan. Thanks for your lecture. My name is Thomas Sterling. I'd like just to hear your opinion about the Kurds more deeply. We know there's a very big Kurdish minority in Iraq, Iran, in Syria, and of course in Turkey, and you showed us the vast territory they're controlling at the moment. So what is your opinion to the chance of getting a Kurdish state in this situation, and who is actually supporting the Kurds, besides them supporting themselves in a flourishing area in Erbil, where they really established a actually working state?
Yeah, with regard to the Kurds, the important and unfortunate first thing to note about the Kurdish nationalism is that it remains beset by its long-standing inability to unite. There's a contiguous section of ground controlled by the Kurds, but it's divided into two separate rival authorities: the Kurdish Democratic Party of Masoud Barzani in northern Iraq and the PKK in the enclaves in Syria. And for as long as there's no unity, it seems to me, the Kurds will be beset by difficulties. Now, Barzani's area is the one closest to de facto sovereignty. I've been there many times, and perhaps some of you have been there too. You know that when you fly into Erbil airport, you know, you see one Iraqi flag there because they have to have that for protocol's sake, and there are about 500 Kurdish flags everywhere else, the Kurdish language and the rest. But basically, this looks like and is the airport, the national airport of an entity which is a state in everything but name. But having said that, the process of moving on from being a state in everything but name to being an actual state is still a difficult one from the Kurdish point of view. Both the government in Baghdad and the Republic of Turkey are not in favour of the establishment of a Kurdish state. The West, and most importantly I think, the Western countries, America and also Western Europe, remain committed to the territorial integrity of the Republic of Iraq and committed to Turkey as a NATO member with its deep concerns about Kurdish statehood. My own view, at least, is that we should begin to move beyond those definitions, because they belong a little bit to a past time and not our current reality, in which the Kurdish regional government is one of the very few solidly pro-Western governments in the region. But that's where things are currently at. So the Kurds have de facto control of northern Iraq, They're sovereign in everything but name, but the way forward from sovereign in everything but name to real sovereignty remains long and strewn with difficult obstacles. Who's supporting them? Well, they're gaining direct support now from in terms of arms, from a number of European countries, Czech Republic as well, and the Germans also. They are financially a country which is, or an area which is full of oil, and which therefore is now increasingly managing to market its oil, or try hard to market its oil elsewhere. They have, by the way, a good relationship behind the scenes with the State of Israel, and this is something which is not reported much, but which is very much an important aspect of that country's international relations. So they are strong and they're sticking around. This is Iraqi Kurdistan. With regard to Syrian Kurdish enclaves, they're far more impoverished, far more provisional, and far more isolated. The PKK-controlled enclaves have no international support of any real kind in terms of an ongoing process. Having said that, astonishingly, we are living in a time in which, in the course of the last month and up until today, the United States Air Force has been acting as the air wing of an organization which is on the list of proscribed terrorist organizations of both the United States and the European Union, namely PKK. That is the strangeness of the time in which we are living. And not only is it a partnership that exists, but it is a partnership that works very well. In fact, it is the only partnership that's really given ISIS some real defeats in the course of the last months, in the town of Kobani, if you remember, back in January, and now increasingly across northeastern Syria and into northern Raqqa province. So my own sense with regard to the Syrian Kurdish enclaves, they are not going to have anything like the level of international support and legitimacy that KRG has in northern Iraq. But they're also not going to disappear anytime soon. I've been inside those enclaves, and they are among the most quiet and effectively governed, not always democratically governed, but effectively governed areas in Syria today. And my own sense is they're going to be around for a very long time to come. All three of the enclaves are there, all three of them are defensible, and they're going to be around for a long time to come. So, is there going to be a Kurdish state very soon? I think in an official sense, no. But is there going to be areas of de facto Kurdish rule and Kurdish government in northern Iraq and northern Syria for the foreseeable future? The answer in that regard is absolutely yes.
Hello, my name is Karen Glasser. I have two questions. The first one, I was very much surprised when ISIS and Nusra cooperated to attack Libya, because I thought that they would oppose each other, aiming to conquer more territory in Syria. So maybe you could explain a little bit what is their relationship. And the second question is, I was again very surprised when ISIS attacked a Palestinian camp in Libya, because I thought that an Islamist organization would take side for the Palestinian cause. Obviously it does not, so maybe you could explain how this relationship is. Thank you.
Yes, a very interesting question as well. With regard to ISIS and Nusra, as you correctly note, it is there is a basic inconsistency here. That is to say, the two movements fight each other when they have a reason to fight each other, and this does not stop them apparently from being able to work together when they have an interest in working together. For example, ISIS carved out its state in Raqqa, its entity in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, largely at the expense of Nusra. It fought Nusra back in last summer, defeated them and drove them southwards. It was a bloody battle, and there were deaths on both sides. This did not stop, and has not stopped, the two movements from cooperating in the western part of the country, in Kalamoun Mountains, into Lebanon, which you asked about. They cooperate there, and they'll continue to cooperate there because they have a joint interest in taking the war into Lebanon if they can. If they can work together to do that, then why not? We often see in the region these kind of very, very pragmatic, temporary alliances in which each side aligns with the other with the full intention of replacing the other at a certain later point. But the alliance works because each one thinks that he'll be the one to eventually triumph over the other. So in the meantime, they manage to work together quite effectively. Now, you asked about Yarmouk, and before I try to answer the issue of ISIS relations to the Palestinian question, we should note that Yarmouk was an additional example of cooperation between ISIS and Nusra. That's to say, it was a neighborhood controlled by Nusra, Hajar al-Aswad, from which the ISIS forces on April 1st came into the Yarmouk camp. And it is to that area which they have subsequently, to some extent at least, withdrawn. So once again, in the south, we're witnessing ISIS, Nusra, apparent cooperation. What can be said of an interesting nature in this regard, I think, is the following. I think that Nusra's cooperation with ISIS, specifically in the southern, crucial sector of the south of Damascus area, relates to Nusra's troubled relations with the non-jihadi rebels who are a force to be reckoned with in southern Syria. We saw that they recently captured a border crossing into Jordan, the Nasif border crossing, and that there's been increasing disputes between the non-jihadi rebels and Nusra over the question of control of that border. I suspect, although I don't know, that this is related to something bigger, namely that the Western supporters of the rebels in the south don't want them to have nice relations with Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, and that's causing rifts, at least on some level or another. I therefore think, and I'm speculating here, but it's informed speculation, I hope, that Nusra's attitude towards ISIS in southwest Syria is informed by that reality. That is to say, Nusra says, okay, well, if you're going to not cooperate with us because of your Western backers, we're going to have to make friends with the other guys who want to come along here, which is the Islamic State. And this, I think, we're witnessing in the Yarmouk camp in the last 2 weeks. With regard to the broader issue of the Palestinian cause, look, ISIS, or Islamic State, rejects all nationalist causes within the Arab world as illegitimate. That's not to say that it doesn't wish to destroy Israel. Of course, it wants very much to destroy Israel. But it wants to destroy Israel on the basis of a united Muslim camp fighting under the banners of Islam, not under the banners of this or that national state in the Arab world. So ISIS' attitude towards the Palestinian question, I would say, is analogous to its attitude towards all other Arab states, namely that no state in the Arab world is legitimate. All these divisions of Muslims into separate supposed national communities is a false thing that comes from the West and that has to be gotten rid of. It means that ISIS is keen to hit at Israel. We think of the Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, the southern, the branch of ISIS in northern Sinai has pledged allegiance. They have been guilty of a number of attacks against Israelis. But these attacks are not carried out on the basis of support for the cause of Palestinian nationalism, but rather on the basis of the need to reconquer an area that was ruled by Islam, that fell into the hands of infidels, so-called, and that needs to be reconquered as soon as possible. So this is the point. They are against the enemies of the Palestinians in many ways, but they're equally opposed to any nationalism which seeks to divide Muslim population as they would see it.
Yeah, I can follow up on this question concerning Yarmouk and this ISIS offensive there. Certain news reports interpreted these fightings in Yarmouk as a sign of ISIS getting ever closer to, to Damascus and the center of power of the Assad regime. Is that what they want? Are they really? Is that in their strategic, perspective, really, to try to engage the Assad regime within Damascus and try to, wrest power from the Assad regime in Damascus? Is that what they want at the moment?
ISIS wants to conquer ground, and certainly ISIS is serious about capturing Arab capitals, whether they are Baghdad or Damascus. They have no aversion to doing that. But the issue of Damascus right now is more to do with the immediate tactical problems that ISIS has than to do with any grand strategy. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the Islamic State can no longer advance forward to its east, because if it does so, it is hit by the Iraqi armed forces, the Shia militias, and the United States Air Force. So it can no longer conquer ground further east. It can't conquer ground further north as well, because then it has the same problem with regard to the United States Air Force and Kurdish fighters on the ground. So if the Islamic State wants to move forward anywhere, it has only the southwestern direction to push forward in. The wonderful thing from ISIS' point of view about the direction of the southwest is that it doesn't have to worry about American air power down there, because of course the American air power is not going to be employed in the service of the Assad regime. Yeah? The Americans will not intervene to save Assad from ISIS. Which means that there, the huge disadvantage which they've had to cope with since last August of being up against the best air force in the world with absolutely no air component or capability of their own is nullified. In the southwest it doesn't exist. And this is the reason I think why Islamic State is now putting energy into trying to conquer ground in the southwest. Now it's an important thing to remember, and we know this from the experience of what took place in Mosul, that while the Islamic State may appear to suddenly just arrive out of the blue sky one fine day in area A or B. That's not really what happens. What actually happens is that a long process of preparation of the area takes place in the preceding months, in which men are recruited into small cells, small areas of organisation, and that existing network can then be sort of switched on at the appropriate moment. That's what took place in Mosul, and I suspect that ISIS is probably busy trying to weave a similar tapestry, so to speak, in the area surrounding Damascus, with the intention that they'll be able to switch that on at the appropriate moment. I think Yarmouk could well be the beginnings of a larger ISIS engagement in the southwesterly direction in the months ahead. It doesn't mean they're going to destroy the Assad regime, I don't suppose they will, but it does mean that they could certainly be becoming a real factor in the rebel-controlled areas in the southwest, perhaps clashing with other rebel forces and trying to replace them in the way that they have in the past, and therefore causing a huge irritant and a huge complication for the current Western policy in southwest Syria, which is to support the rebels in the only part of the country where non-jihadi rebels, at least up until now, had maintained some degree of cohesion and some degree of power and influence.
More questions?
I have two questions. Is there still an independent movement resisting Assad that is not either al-Nusra or ISIS or the Kurdish rebellion, or has it vanished? And the second question is, you mentioned the support of Qatar and Turkey, but what evidence do you have and what kind of support is it?
With regard to an independent movement which is neither Nusra nor ISIS, yes, certainly there is. I mean, in southern Syria, as I mentioned, there is a group of militias organised into what we could call the Southern Front. And these militias are playing a very important role in Dara and in Quneitra provinces in fighting against the Assad regime, together with Nusra and in cooperation with Nusra, but still they're important in their own right. They're supported by the West via a command room, we are told, in Amman, where the representatives of both West and the Gulf Arabs are situated, and they are in existence, and they are fighting on the ground, and they matter, and we shouldn't forget them, but only in the southwest of the country. In the east of the country, of course, ISIS has finished everybody else off, and in the northwest of the country, Nusra is in an advanced state of doing the same. And it is likely that in the months ahead, Nusra will emerge as the undisputed dominant force of the rebellion in northwest Syria. Beyond that, of course, as you are aware, and as we are all aware, there is an official leadership of the Syrian revolution in political form, which we find popping up in various capitals of the world. And when they have negotiations in Geneva, these men sit there and talk as if they represent the Syrian opposition. I must tell you in all frankness that these men, in my estimation at least, do not represent anybody in Syria. They may well consider themselves a leadership of something or another, but actually they are not able to give an order. Anybody actually does anything at all within Syria itself. So this is a fiction to a considerable extent, this so-called opposition. So this is with regard to the issue of non-jihadi, non-Islamist opposition to Assad. Let me just say, final on this point, it's tragic that, of course, the uprising began as a civilian set of protests, and then there were great sections of the revolution that were non-Islamist and that were secular. Unfortunately, as the revolution turned into a war, the men who were good at that, who were willing to take up arms and who were doing it in an organised way, were overwhelmingly Sunni Islamists, and as a result, they have inherited effectively the Syrian revolution. With regard to Qatar and Turkish support for Nusra, or Turkish support for jihadis in the north of the country, there is some considerable evidence that has already emerged. In January 29th, I believe it was, of last year, a convoy of 3 trucks heading towards the Turkish-Syrian border was stopped by the Turkish gendarme, the Turkish local police. And even though the gendarme were advised by those in the trucks that this was a government operation and they shouldn't try to impede the progress of these trucks, the gendarmerie nevertheless did so, searched the trucks, and found that these were containing weaponry, including some high-caliber weapons, on their way to the Turkish-Syrian border, and this was revealed to be an operation of the Turkish MIT, so Turkish intelligence. This has been a subject of keen discussion in the Turkish media. What we can say with considerable confidence then is that these trucks were heading to a part of Syria controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra, and this was Turkish government operation, very clearly and obviously to bring weaponry to their friends in Jabhat al-Nusra among the rebels or jihadis in the north of that country. Additional circumstantial evidence we can find if we look at the way in which the Turkish army has acted to keep the border open for jihadis fighting against Kurds, against the Kurdish YPG, and I've seen footage of this process, and this is real. So the Turks very clearly are behind Nusra, at least to some extent. Not because they themselves are jihadis, but because they're very worried about the Kurdish advances in northern Syria, and they're happy to help people who are preventing that. With regard to Qatar, the main evidence comes from the pattern of hostage releases, which we can see. That's to say that when Qatar has intervened to pay ransoms of hostages held by Nusra, and as a result those hostages have been released. But the Qatari involvement with Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist forces, in addition to Nusra in northern Syria, is no secret. I mean, the Qataris themselves admit it, and they're quite open about it, and it's no problem at all. The issue is linking them to Nusra, because of course Nusra is Al-Qaeda, and so it's harder to find the specific evidence, so there is some. But with regard to other rebel forces in northern Syria, Tawhid Brigade, if you're familiar with them from Aleppo and a number of others, the relationship with Qatar is an open relationship. The Qataris don't deny their active support for Islamist rebels in northern Syria. So yes, I think this is the evidence in that regard with regard to both Qatar and Turkey.
I think this is a good point to come to an end. I want to add, because we were speaking about Qatar at the moment, of course that in our small book here there is this brilliant piece of yours about the regional ambitions of Qatar and what Qatar did and did achieve or did not achieve in the last couple of years. So all that's left for me is thank you very much for you coming here and letting us take part and profit from your insights. Vielen Dank für Ihr Kommen und Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Wenn Sie den Raum verlassen, werden Sie draußen die Möglichkeit haben, diese Bücher in die Hand zu bekommen. Die werden dort auflegen. Wir danken für die Aufmerksamkeit und ich hoffe, wir werden uns bei einer unserer zukünftigen Veranstaltungen wieder über den Weg laufen. Dankeschön.